Because margins and padding are one of the more confusing aspects of working with CSS, I want to take a moment here and do a little exercise just to help you appreciate how margins and padding work. Let's start by just creating a new blank document. So it's just an HTML file, nothing special. Let's go ahead and save it. And I'm just going to call this margins. Click in the document. You can add a title if you want to. So I want you to start by inserting a div into the main area of this page. And as you build CSS layouts, inserting divs is really one of the fundamental building blocks of creating these designs. So just click on the Insert Div tag, and you see the Insert Div dialog comes up. Now you can create and apply styles as you create divs if you want. So let's do that this time. Let's call this spacing. And I want to point something out here. The name of an ID must begin with a pound sign. However, when you insert a name into the Insert Div tag, you're actually associating the ID with the div. So you don't want to include the pound sign in this dialog. When I click OK, you'll see at the bottom of the screen div pound spacing. And Dreamweaver automatically inserts that pound, recognizing that this is an ID style. In the code behind the scenes, you see ID equals spacing, and that's why you don't want to put a pound sign in that dialog. So now let's create a style for the spacing ID. So if I click on the New Style icon, you'll see that Dreamweaver recognizes that I already have a div tag on this page and that it's already associated with an ID called pound spacing. So it assumes that's probably the style I want to create. I'm going to keep this in this document only. Just click OK. Let's start by setting the background color of this to blue. Just a nice light blue color. It will help us to see what's going on in a little bit. Then let's go to the box category, and let's give this a width of 500. And let's put some padding in here. Let's put 10 pixels of padding all the way around, and let's put 50 pixels of margins. Remember, if you want to specify a different amount of margin or padding, you just deselect that option, and you can change these to be 4 different settings. But for now, let's just keep it consistent all the way around. And let's also set up a border color, because that'll help us to see what's going on. And it'll show you how the border settings work at the same time. When you use the border settings in a CSS style rule, you're essentially adding a border around the outside of the element. You can use this with images, you can use this with divs, almost any tag that could have a border, you can add a border using these options. And similar to padding and margins, you can have that border go all the way around all 4 sides, or you can create a border that's only on 1, 2, or 3 sides. And in that way, you can actually create dividing lines and other design elements where you just want a simple line that stays right at the edge of an element. Again, for now, I'm going to keep the same for all, and I'm going to create a simple solid border. I'm going to make it pretty thick. Let's go ahead and make a thick border, or better yet, let's make a 5-pixel border so that we know exactly how thick it is. And then let's make it a nice dark burgundy color so that it stands out against that blue color. Now when we click OK, because that spacing style is already specified as the ID for the div tag, that new style information is automatically applied to the div. Now there's one other thing I want to do just to help make this a little easier to understand. I want you to modify page properties, and I want to set the margins for the page to 0. Remember, most browsers display web pages with about an 8-pixel margin at the top and the left of the page. And that's going to throw off what I'm going to do here to show you the total space this takes up. So I'm going to set all of these to 0 so that our new div tag and all of its related padding, margins, and border start at exactly 0 in the top left-hand side of this page. When I click OK, you'll see that my div will move up and over just a little. And now I want you to click on the div tag itself. And notice that Dreamweaver gives you some very nice visual imagery to show you the margins around this, the 50 pixels of margin space, and the padding inside, that 10 pixels of padding that's inside the div tag. By the way, if you don't see these, it's possible because you've hidden all of your visual aids. Just make sure you have the visual aids turned on, and these should become immediately visible as soon as you select the div tag. I want you to think of padding as a kind of cushion inside a box. It's designed to make sure your content doesn't bump into the sides of your box. So when I deselect that, you can see if I didn't have that padding in there, the words content for ID spacing goes here would bump right up against the edge of that and not be nearly as visually appealing or as easy to read. So padding's a nice way to add a little space inside your elements. Think of margins as a way to add space between boxes so they don't bump into each other on the page, and really between anything you might have on the page. But here's the really confusing thing, because it's pretty easy. I'm sure you've already got the idea. Padding's on the inside, margins on the outside. Okay, I got that clear. But here's the thing that can really trip you up. When you specify the width of a div tag, this width, for example, is 500 pixels wide, you have to add the padding to the total width. I'm going to turn on the rulers to show you how this works. So if I set rulers here, show rulers, I've got them set to pixels. I want you to notice that my div, which if we look at the style information over here, we can confirm that my div called spacing has a style that's 500 pixels wide. So, you might assume this would take up about 500 pixels on the page, but no, not at all. What's it doing here? It's taking up 500 pixels plus, oh yeah, I've got 50 pixels of margin on each side. Well, okay, so you might assume that with 50 pixels of margin on each side, it would take up 500 plus 50 plus 50, 600. But it's taking up more than 600 pixels on this page. And that's because most web browsers will add the amount of padding and border to the total size or total width of your div. So if you add 10 pixels of padding to the inside of a div, you've effectively created a div that's 520 pixels wide, 10 pixels on each side, plus 500 for the width. This one is 530 pixels wide because it has a 5-pixel border around it. So that border is 5 pixels on each side. The padding is 10 pixels on each side. That's 30 pixels plus 500 brings us to 530 pixels of space. So you can actually pull that ruler out here to set that to 0 and confirm pretty well that that's about 530 pixels. Let me just grab a guide so you can see that's 550 and that's 530. So here's the rule that can be confusing. The width of any box element must include any specified padding plus any borders. Now, if that's not confusing enough, here's another word of warning. Although this rule is now pretty consistently supported on the most recent versions of the most common web browsers, that is, IE 7 and Firefox and Safari will all display padding and borders as adding additional space around a div tag like this, there are some exceptions. For example, anybody who might still be using version 5 of Internet Explorer will see this very differently. Unfortunately, Microsoft, lagging a little behind web standards, did not count padding as additional space in a div tag like this in Internet Explorer 5. And that's just one example of the many differences in how CSS is displayed on different web browsers and why your web pages may not look exactly the same to everyone who visits your pages.